A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother. It is March 18th, 2026, and we have a really fascinating and, frankly, quite sobering topic to dive into today.
Herman Poppleberry at your service. Yeah, Corn, our housemate Daniel sent over a prompt this morning that really gets to the core of the geopolitical shift we have been seeing accelerate over the last 2 years. He was asking about the origins and the strange, almost contradictory architecture of what we call the axis of resistance.
It is a great prompt because when you look at a map of this so-called axis today, it does not make any sense on the surface. If you were to pull up a digital map and pin the primary nodes, you would be looking at a revolutionary Shiite theocracy in Tehran, a secular post-Soviet autocracy in Moscow, a communist, hyper-isolated hermit kingdom in Pyongyang, and a massive capitalist communist hybrid in Beijing. Then you throw in non-state actors like the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and various militias in Iraq and Syria. On paper, these groups should have nothing to say to each other. They do not share a language, they do not share a religion, and in many cases, they have historically been rivals or even enemies.
If you went back 20 years and told a strategic analyst that North Korean ballistic missile technology would be integrated into Houthi maritime interdiction systems in the Red Sea, while being supported by Russian electronic warfare suites and Chinese dual-use satellite data, they would have called you crazy. But here we are in early 2026, and what was once a loose collection of regional proxies has turned into a vertically integrated, functional military architecture. It is no longer just a series of handshakes, it is a machine.
That is the key phrase right there, vertically integrated. We talked about the shift toward this unified multi-front strategy back in episode 7 on 66, but today I want us to really peel back the layers on how they actually built this. Is it a coalition of the willing, or as you have suggested before, a coalition of the desperate? And how does Iran, as the central orchestrator, decide who gets a seat at the table and who is left out in the cold?
It is a brilliant question. To understand the origins, we have to look past the ideological rhetoric. If you listen to the official statements from Tehran or Moscow, they talk about anti-imperialism, sovereignty, and a multipolar world. But the reality is much more transactional. The axis of resistance is not a values-based alliance like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a utility-based network. It is a functional response to a specific problem. How do you undermine a technologically and economically superior adversary like the United States and its allies, specifically Israel, without triggering a direct conventional war that you would almost certainly lose?
Right, so the shared utility is the glue. But before we get into the mechanics, let us address the selection criteria Daniel mentioned. Iran is the hub of this wheel. How do they pick their spokes? Why the Houthis and not, say, a state-level actor like Algeria, or even a more robust group in a different theater?
Well, Iran looks for 3 specific things: asymmetric capability, geographic leverage, and what I call deniable dependency. They do not want partners who are too strong or too independent. They want actors who are capable of causing outsized damage, but who are entirely dependent on the Iranian hub for their high-end technical survival. The Houthis are the perfect example. Before 2015, they were a provincial rebel group in northern Yemen. Iran saw a group sitting on one of the most important maritime choke points in the world, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. By injecting sophisticated drone and missile technology into that specific node, Iran gained the ability to hold the entire global economy hostage for the price of a few cargo ships worth of parts.
That makes sense from a strategic standpoint, but what about the big players? Russia and China are not dependent on Iran in the same way the Houthis are. In fact, it is often the other way around. How did those two end up as part of this functional axis?
That is where the shift in 2024 changed everything. Before the full-scale formalization of the Russia-Iran defense pacts in late 2024, Moscow mostly viewed Iran as a useful nuisance for the West. But after the pressures of the war in Ukraine and the subsequent isolation of the Russian economy, Moscow realized they needed a partner who was already an expert at operating under extreme sanctions. Iran became Russia's primary consultant on shadow banking, drone manufacturing, and sanctions evasion. In return, Russia provided the one thing Iran's proxies lacked: high-end electronic warfare like the Krasukha-4 systems and real-time satellite intelligence.
So it became a trade of specialties. Iran provides the experience and the proxy network, while Russia provides the technical umbrella. And then you have North Korea, which seems to be the specialized hardware store for the whole operation.
Precisely. North Korea is the heavy industrial base of the Axis. They have spent 70 years perfecting the art of building cheap, reliable, and increasingly sophisticated ballistic missiles in tunnels. When Iran needs to scale up the production of a specific airframe for Hezbollah or the militias in Iraq, they do not necessarily design it from scratch. They look at North Korean designs, like the KN-23 or KN-24 variants that have already been flight tested. We have seen a massive uptick in the transfer of solid fuel rocket technology from Pyongyang to Tehran over the last year. This is not about ideology. Kim Jong-un does not care about the theological nuances of the Iranian Revolution. He cares about hard currency, food security, and Russian submarine technology.
It is a grimly efficient system, but it brings up a point we touched on in episode 962 when we looked at the architecture of hatred. While the motivation for Iran is deeply ideological, this existential obsession with destroying Israel, the partners they have brought in do not necessarily share that specific fire. Russia has historically had a complex but functional relationship with Israel. China has massive trade interests. Yet, they are now part of a machine that is actively targeting Israeli and American interests. How does Iran manage that friction?
They manage it by compartmentalizing the objectives. Iran does not ask Russia to declare war on Israel. They ask Russia to provide signal jamming over the eastern Mediterranean that happens to interfere with Israeli defense systems. They do not ask China to stop trading with the West. They ask China to provide the dual-use chips, edge computing hardware, and telecommunications infrastructure that allow the Axis to maintain a secure, encrypted command and control network. Each member provides a specific service that benefits the whole, without needing to sign on to the entire ideological package. It is a marriage of convenience that has become a permanent arrangement because the West's response, broad sanctions and isolation, has left them with no other viable partners.
It is almost like a decentralized mesh network. In computing, a mesh network does not rely on a single central server that can be knocked out. Instead, every node connects to every other node. If one path is blocked, the data, or in this case the weapons and money, just finds another route.
That is a perfect analogy, Korn, and it explains why the Axis is so hard to dismantle. If you strike a Houthi launch site, you have not actually hurt the network's ability to function. The intelligence for that strike might have been provided by a Russian satellite. The missile airframe was based on a North Korean design. The guidance chip was purchased through a Chinese shell company in Southeast Asia, and the launch orders were relayed through an Iranian server using Russian encryption protocols. Which part of that do you attack to stop the next launch? You are fighting a ghost in the machine.
This leads me to the exclusion question from Daniel's prompt. There are plenty of countries that are openly anti-Israel or anti-American. Think about some of the hardline states in North Africa, or even within the Middle East, that talk a big game. Why aren't they part of this inner circle? Why is this group so exclusive?
This is one of the most important things to understand about how the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps operates. They actually avoid state-level partners who have too much to lose. A country like Algeria, or even a state like Iraq as a whole, has a seat at the United Nations, a central bank, and a civilian population that wants stability and access to global markets. If they join a militant axis, they become a target for conventional retaliation. Iran prefers what I call the hollow state model. They want to operate in places where the central government is either weak, non-existent, or completely co-opted. Lebanon, Yemen, parts of Syria. In these places, Iran can build a state within a state.
So they want the capability of a state without the accountability of one.
If a Houthi missile hits a commercial tanker, who do you hold accountable? The Yemeni government in Aden? They barely have control over their own building. The Houthis themselves? They are a non-state actor living in hardened tunnels. If Iran recruited a functional, sovereign state into the Axis, that state would constantly be pushing back against risky operations because they do not want their power plants bombed or their ports blockaded. By choosing proxies and desperate pariah states like North Korea, Iran ensures that their partners have no choice but to keep escalating. They have no off-ramp.
That is a chilling realization. It also explains why we have seen the Axis keep traditional regional powers at arm's length. Even when Turkey or Qatar align with Iranian interests on specific issues, they are never truly part of the functional military architecture because they are too integrated into the global system. They have too many points of vulnerability. They have McDonald's and Starbucks and international banking connections. You cannot be a part of the vertical military integration if you are worried about your currency collapsing because of a U.S. Treasury sanction.
Right, and you also have to look at the risk of infiltration. The more legitimate and open a country is, the easier it is for Western intelligence to monitor what is happening. The current Axis members, Iran, North Korea, Russia, are all black holes for information. They are closed societies with massive counterintelligence apparatuses. This allows them to run the shadow supply chain that we have been tracking.
Let us talk about that shadow supply chain for a minute. You mentioned it earlier, and I think it is the most impressive and terrifying part of this whole structure. How are they moving the physical hardware for this multi-front pressure system without getting caught?
It is a masterclass in logistics. They have moved beyond the old model of flying cargo planes into Damascus. Now, they use the Caspian Sea as a private highway. Since Russia and Iran both border the Caspian, and no other international power has a presence there, they can move whatever they want between the port of Astrakhan in Russia and the port of Anzali in Iran with zero oversight. From there, it goes overland through Iraq and into Syria and Lebanon. For the Houthis, they use a fleet of what they call dhows, traditional wooden sailing vessels that look like fishing boats but are actually carrying modular missile components.
And because the components are modular, they can be smuggled in pieces and assembled on site. You do not need to ship a whole missile, you just need to ship the guidance kit in one boat, the fuel cells in another, and the warhead in a third.
And this is where the North Korean connection is so vital. They have become experts at miniaturizing these components so they fit into standard shipping containers or small boats. We have even seen reports recently of 3D printing facilities being set up in Yemen and Lebanon. The Axis sends the digital blueprints and the raw specialized filaments, and the proxies print the drone frames locally. This reduces the logistical footprint and makes it almost impossible to stop the flow of technology. You are not stopping a shipment of drones, you are trying to stop a shipment of plastic pellets and a digital file.
It sounds like they have essentially industrialized proxy warfare. It is no longer about sending a few crates of rifles. It is about exporting an entire military-industrial complex in a box.
That is exactly what it is. And the result is what we are seeing today, the ability to synchronize attacks across 3 distinct theaters simultaneously. In early 2026, we have seen the Axis coordinate maritime interdiction in the Red Sea, drone swarms in the Persian Gulf, and missile tests in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are forcing the United States and its allies to spread their defenses so thin that a breakthrough becomes inevitable somewhere. It is a strategy of exhaustion.
It is the multi-front doctrine we discussed in episode 766, but it has reached a level of sophistication that I do not think people were prepared for. It is not just about overwhelming defenses. It is about exhausting the political will of the West. If every time you solve a problem in the Red Sea, a new one pops up in the Caspian or the Levant, eventually the public starts asking why we are involved in all these places at once.
And that is the ultimate goal. The Axis knows they cannot win a head-to-head fight with the United States Navy or the Israeli Air Force, but they do not have to. They just have to make the cost of maintaining the current security architecture higher than the West is willing to pay. By using this functional, non-ideological network, they have created a system that is incredibly cheap for them to operate and incredibly expensive for us to defend against. Think about the math. A $2,000 Shahed drone requires a $2 million interceptor missile to shoot it down. Do that 1,000 times, and you have won the economic war without ever winning a battle.
So, looking at the origins again, would you say this was a grand master plan from the beginning? Or did it evolve organically as these countries found themselves increasingly cornered by the international community?
I think it is a bit of both. Iran definitely had the vision for the regional proxy network back in the 1980s. But the expansion into a global functional axis with Russia and North Korea was a marriage of convenience that turned into a permanent arrangement. Every time the West increased sanctions on one of these actors, it drove them closer to the others. We essentially created a parallel economy and a parallel military supply chain by isolating them all at the same time. They had no choice but to build their own system, and they did it with a level of ruthlessly pragmatic engineering that we often underestimate.
It is a classic case of second-order effects. You sanction a country to weaken it, but if you sanction enough countries, you give them a common market and a common cause. You create a club of the excluded.
Precisely. And now that the infrastructure is built, the shipping routes, the encrypted comms, the standardized missile components, it is very hard to undo. Even if the regime in Tehran were to change tomorrow, the network itself has its own momentum. The Houthi commanders in Yemen now have the technical know-how to maintain these systems themselves. The Russian engineers in Iran have integrated their systems into the Iranian defense grid. The toothpaste is out of the tube.
This brings us to a really interesting point about the exclusion of certain actors. If the network is so successful, why aren't more groups trying to join? You mentioned the risk of state-level accountability, but what about other non-state actors? Why don't we see, for example, groups in Southeast Asia or South America being brought into this vertical integration?
I think there is a geographic limit to how far Iran can project this specific type of orchestration. To make this work, you need that shadow supply chain we talked about. You need a way to get the physical hardware to the theater. Right now, that relies on the land bridge through Iraq and the maritime routes around the Arabian Peninsula. If you are a rebel group in, say, the Philippines or Colombia, Iran cannot easily get a North Korean ballistic missile kit to you without it being intercepted. The axis is currently a contiguous or semi-contiguous geographic arch. It is a shield across the heart of the Eurasian landmass.
So, the Caspian Shield, as we called it in episode 1133, is the physical anchor of the whole thing. Without that secure backyard where they can move assets freely, the whole architecture becomes much more vulnerable.
That is why the relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan is so critical, which we covered in that episode. Azerbaijan is the one potential crack in that Caspian backyard. If the Axis loses control of the narrative or the security in that region, their internal supply lines are suddenly at risk. It is the one place where they are actually vulnerable to conventional diplomatic and military pressure.
That is a great connection. It shows that even though this axis looks monolithic and unstoppable, it relies on very specific geographic and logistical bottlenecks. It is a high-tech machine, but it still needs physical roads and secure waters to function.
It does. And that leads to one of the biggest misconceptions people have about the axis of resistance. People tend to think of it as this top-down command structure where the supreme leader in Tehran pushes a button and everyone moves in unison. In reality, it is much more like a franchise model. Iran provides the branding, the training, and the specialized equipment, but the local nodes have a huge amount of tactical autonomy. This is a feature, not a bug. It means that if you take out a commander in Lebanon, the group in Yemen does not skip a beat. They know the mission, they have the tools, and they have the authority to act on their own.
It is the ultimate asymmetric setup. You have the strategic depth of major powers like Russia and China, but the tactical flexibility of a guerrilla insurgency. It is a hybrid that the West's traditional military structures are struggling to counter, because we are looking for a center of gravity to strike, and there isn't just one.
And that is why the selection criteria are so focused on those asymmetric capabilities. Iran does not want a proxy that is going to try to fight a tank battle. They want a proxy that is going to use a $2,000 drone to take out a $1 billion destroyer. That is the math that makes the Axis work. They are playing a game of cost imposition.
So, If we are looking at the practical takeaways for our listeners, what should they be watching for as indicators of where this is going next? If the origins were transactional and the growth was based on utility, what happens when the utility changes?
The first thing to watch is the tech transfer metrics. Every time you see a report of a new North Korean missile test or a new Russian electronic warfare deployment in Ukraine, you should assume that technology will appear in the Middle East within 6 months. The speed of that transfer is the best indicator of the health of the axis. If the transfer slows down, it means the supply lines are being squeezed. If it accelerates, it means they have found a new way to bypass our surveillance.
And the second thing would be the integration of artificial intelligence into these systems. We have started to see the first signs of autonomous drone swarms being tested in the region. If the Axis can move from remote-controlled systems to truly autonomous ones, the pressure on Western defenses will increase exponentially. You won't be jamming a signal anymore because there won't be a signal to jam.
That is the next frontier, and it is where the Chinese contribution becomes vital. While Russia provides the heavy electronic warfare, China provides the edge computing hardware and the AI frameworks that allow these systems to become smarter and more independent. If you are a listener trying to understand the news, stop looking for ideological statements. Look for the movement of specialized hardware and the signing of technical cooperation agreements. That is where the real story of the Axis is written. When you see a technical cooperation agreement between a Chinese telecommunications firm and an Iranian defense subsidiary, that is a bigger deal than any speech at the UN.
It is a lot to process. It feels like we are looking at a completely new type of conflict, one that does not fit into the old Cold War boxes. It is more fluid, more technical, and much harder to define. It is not a clash of civilizations. It is a clash of systems.
It really is. And I think the most important thing for people to realize is that this is not a temporary marriage of convenience. This is the new permanent architecture of conflict in the 21st century. These actors have realized that by working together, they can achieve goals that none of them could achieve alone. They have built a system that turns their individual weaknesses into a collective strength. They have learned that they do not need to love each other to work together effectively.
Well, Herman, I think we have covered a lot of ground here. We have looked at how this coalition was born out of shared desperation and utility, how Iran meticulously selects partners based on their ability to cause asymmetric damage, and why they avoid legitimate states that might bring too much accountability to the table.
And we have seen how the shadow supply chain, from the Caspian Sea to the Red Sea, is the literal nervous system of this whole operation. It is a sobering picture, but I think it is an essential one for understanding why the world looks the way it does in 2026. We are no longer dealing with isolated regional fires. We are dealing with a single, integrated global conflagration.
Definitely. I want to circle back to one of the points from Daniel's prompt about the exclusion of other countries. We talked about the hollow state model, but there is also a religious component that we should not ignore, even if the alliance itself is non-ideological. Iran still faces a major hurdle in recruiting Sunni-majority states into a Shiite-led military architecture.
That is a great point, Corn. Even with the pragmatism of the Axis, the thousand-year-old sectarian divide in Islam still acts as a natural brake on its expansion. This is why groups like Hamas or the Houthis, who are either Sunni or Zaidi, are so valuable to Iran. They are the bridges that allow a Shiite power to project influence into the broader Muslim world. But for a state like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, joining an Iranian-led axis would not just be a strategic mistake, it would be a theological and political impossibility. They would rather form a defensive alliance with their historical enemies than submit to an Iranian-led regional order.
So the axis has a natural ceiling. It can grow deep, but it can only grow so wide before it hits those cultural and religious walls. It is a powerful network, but it is also a self-limiting one.
And that is actually the silver lining here. The Axis is a powerful integrated network, but it is also a pariah network. It is limited to those who have nowhere else to go. As long as the rest of the world remains integrated and cooperative, the Axis remains an island, a dangerous island, but an island nonetheless. The danger is if the West continues to fragment. If more countries feel excluded from the global system, the Axis's utility starts to look a lot more attractive to them.
That is a helpful way to frame it. It is a powerful network, but But it is also a symptom of isolation. The more these countries are cut off, the more they are forced to innovate and cooperate in the shadows.
Right. And for our listeners who want to go deeper on the specific ideological roots of Iran's strategy, I really recommend going back and listening to episode 962. It provides the why behind the how we discussed today. Understanding that existential motivation is key to realizing why they are willing to work with anyone, even secular communists or atheistic autocrats, to achieve their goals.
And if you are interested in the more recent military developments, episode 766 on the unified multi-front strategy is essential listening. It really sets the stage for the vertical integration we have seen over the last year. It explains how they move from supporting proxies to integrating them into a single command structure.
I think we have given people a lot to chew on. This topic is not going away anytime soon. If anything, the coordination between these disparate actors is only going to get tighter as we move further into 2026. We should keep a close eye on the upcoming defense summit in Pyongyang that will likely be the next major milestone for the Axis's hardware standardization.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to say thanks to Daniel for sending this in. It is one of those topics that you see in the headlines every day, but you rarely get a chance to step back and look at the actual engineering of the system. It is easy to get lost in the politics and miss the plumbing.
Yeah, it was a great prompt. It forced us to look at the plumbing of geopolitics, which is where the real power usually lies. If you want to understand the future, follow the spare parts and the digital blueprints.
If you have been enjoying the show and our deep dives into these weird and complex prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We are trying to build our own network here, though hopefully a much more positive one than the one we discussed today.
It really does help. And remember, you can find our entire archive of over 1,300 episodes at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly, and all the links to our other platforms.
We also have a Telegram channel that you can find by searching for My Weird Prompts. We post every time a new episode drops, and we often share the maps and technical diagrams that Herman references during the show. It is a great way to stay up to date.
Alright, I think that is it for today. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn Poppleberry. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
Until next time.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, stay curious.
And keep those prompts coming. We love digging into these.
We really do. See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth.